This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor begins today's show with a cattle market update. He discusses the survey data for the November meat demand monitor, as well as other customer information. Continuing the show are K-State Assistant Professors Logan Britton and Nellie Hill-Sullins as they discuss their research on challenges producers of specialty livestock are experiencing. Drew Ricketts, K-State Wildlife Specialist, rounds out today's show by reviewing how to manage raccoons and why this time of year is good to do so. He also warns people about a fly bait that is commonly used off-label, which is illegal. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update. And this week we're joined by K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, and happy holidays to everybody.
Glynn, kicking off our cattle market conversation, discussing what cash cattle markets are looking like.
Yeah, so we had a little improvement this past week, coming off of multiple weeks of pull down and emotions are elevated. AMS called the cash markets, Kansas fed cattle on Friday at 170, called the 5 area at 168. Depending on exactly when I pegged those would be either flat or maybe just a hair up from the week before, depending on what days we're comparing. When we look over to feeder cattle, AMS called Dodge City overall flat, steady, showed up in their verbiage a couple different times. Couple lots just to give us some reference. There weren't as many head, and that's not surprising this time of year. 154 head weighing 628 pounds sold for 263, and then a lot of 107 head weighing 917 pounds came in at 207. So the feeder cattle market was also, I would call it, steady this past week.
And what about the futures contracts?
Yeah, so we saw more improvement there, and hopefully it'll spill over into better cash this coming week. Friday's close for the February live cattle contract was right at 170. That's up about $4 on the week. Then we will look over to feeder cattle. The January contract closed at 221, up about $5 on the week. And that reflects a couple different things. One is there was some more, broader macroeconomic improvement this past week. Some optimism showed up. A lot of commodities that are traded, not just feeder and live cattle contracts and CME, but other commodities had improvement this past week. And I think there was some spillover that helped us there.
In the past, the futures have been described as a little wild or crazy, and so is that improvement helping calm that down?
Well, hopefully. There's theories on why we've had the market pull back the last couple months, and it's not uncommon that emotions get high when we have cattle prices decline, so I'm not surprised by that. So there's a lot of discussion around that, of course, and it's real money, so it's hitting people, so I understand. My main argument is demand has weakened. I'm going to say that in a minute. The ability to pass on higher cost of production compared to the past is slowed, and that's pushing signals back throughout the cattle industry. That is not a fun thing to talk about, but it's also not unique to the cattle industry. It's showing up in a lot of other supply chains. Supply chains have sort of righted in the sense that, the shelves are full and so forth. We got that kind of stuff figured out, which is great compared to a couple of years ago, but that wasn't free, and the cost of getting things there is not what it was before. Inflation appears to be slowing, but the cost of getting things to consumers is well above what it was before the pandemic. So some of these things take time. And now that we've kind of righted the supply side, the consumer is no longer willing to absorb some of those higher prices because they're worried about their finances, as we're going to outline here in a minute.
And before we get to talking about your meat demand monitor, what is box beef cutout looking like?
Yeah, so we did have some additional improvement this past week there, and that's the part I hope continues because that would be signaling the ability to pass on these higher prices more. The choice quote on Friday was $292. That was up about $4 from the prior Friday. And then select came in at $261, up about $3 compared to the prior week. So again, I hope that continues. The majority of the institutional holiday buying is behind us, but individuals, what I mean by that is, placing orders to make sure you have the ribeyes, in place at the grocery store, so forth. But the ability to actually get that in the consumer's hands and pay up for it and so forth is occurring right now. In the days ahead, people are going to be buying, hopefully some ribeyes and the like for their, holiday feast. We'll see how that plays out in the weeks ahead.
And now talking about your meat demand monitor, looking at November and seeing some decreases for people.
Yeah, so pretty much across the board, retail demand in November was down from our meat demand monitor. We had a little improvement in the food service side of things, but the retail demand declining is, unfortunately kind of an ongoing trend here. We track the protein values. So we give a list of 12 things, ask people what, is most important when you're making your protein purchasing decisions. And price remains quite elevated. If my memory serves me right, 4 of the 5 months that have the highest ranking on price, so people putting the most importance on price, since we launched this project in February of 2020, have occurred here in calendar year 2023. So before I kind of lose people geeky details beyond this, the importance of price is very high here in 2023, and that includes November, our most recent data. So price is becoming more prevalent as a top consideration compared to things like origin and traceability, environmental impact, some other things that for the typical person are not top of mind when they're deciding what to put in the grocery cart.
And when looking at people's willingness to pay on stuff, it looks like pork chops is a little bit of an outlier.
Yeah, so, there's demand weakness in the beef and pork categories kind of across the board. The pork chop category may be a little more extreme. This is why you're kind of pulling it out there. Some of our listeners may know the National Pork Board launched something called the Loin Task Force. So pork chops come from the loin, from hogs. And the pork industry is aware that there's plenty of room for demand improvement in all categories, but particularly things that come from the loin, including pork chops that you did the call out. I'm highlighting this because I'm trying to help the industry on that. I'm the economist on that task force, and there's definitely work to be done.
And Glenn, something always important to point out when we're thinking about the meat demand monitor, household finances.
Yeah, so I always highlight some, I call it ad hoc, but, kind of rotating question at the end of my monthly, the base 4-page report we put out every month. And this month, I continue to highlight macroeconomic challenges. So one of the things we ask is each person, over 2,000 people every month, complete this survey. How do your household finances compare now with a year ago? And unfortunately, in November, only 15% say their household finances are better than 12 months earlier. Conversely, 40% say they're worse. And of course, the remaining 45% say they're about the same. So the vast majority are the same or worse. You're in a fortunate minority if you say your finances have improved. But the relevance for the meat industry is if you tell me your finances have improved, you're much more likely to have had beef, pork, or chicken in your prior day meals. Told me that you had it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner the prior day. Conversely, if you tell me your finances have declined, you're much more likely to tell me, no, I actually had something besides those 3 main meats or no protein at all in my meals yesterday, which is not surprising. Meat protein is one of the more expensive, food items we have out there. And it's important, right? I'm kind of a meat geek here, so this is not a dig on it. But when your home finances are being squeezed, lots of things on your budget get squeezed. And I think it is the biggest headwind facing domestic meat demand for sure. And it showed up again here in November. There
are also other USDA reports that support this conversation.
Yeah, so the meat demand monitor is survey-based, and I certainly hope that the beef and pork checkoff that support it find value in it, and our listeners here and others get value out of it. But it is one of several data sources. What I just try to impress us on is weakening domestic meat demand is the punchline from that report. You also find that if you go to K-State's Ag Manager website, you'll find there's USDA data-based demand indices. So yours truly maintains several data sets and, monitors demand in various ways. There's a lag in that USDA data. So I just spoke to November with survey, insights. The most recent info we have from the USDA data is through October, which is one of the reasons we keep multiple data sets. But for the 10 months in 2023 that we have the USDA data complete for, only 3 of those had higher beef demand compared to the same months in 22. Only 2 of them had higher pork demand, and only 4 of the 10 had higher chicken demand. So the majority of the months we've had 1, if not all 3, of those major meats have a demand decline compared to the year before. That's no longer survey-based. That is USDA lagged database, and it confirms what I said earlier. The last thing I'll add to round this out is this past week I wrote an article with the National Hog Farmer doing a deep dive into the November situation for demand. I took multiple pieces of data that I've already referenced here, but I also took scanner data, so transaction data that's available to me via partnership with the National Pork Board, and basically summarized again that the projections for 2023 were projecting, because we didn't have the December data, we basically had 11 of the 12 months in hand. It looks like for all 3 meats, we're going to have domestic retail demand decline in 2023 using scanner data. Specific to beef, which is of most interest to most of our listeners here, the 2023 projections, and again, I'm projecting December, but we know January through November, is retail beef volume would be 3% lower, inflation-adjusted prices would be 1% lower, and that would lead to a net 3% reduction in total sales dollars, the income from sales through the beef industry. The punchline of that, Shelby, is anytime you reduce volume and reduce price, any good economist is going to say that's simple evidence that demand has declined. So if your industry's pushing lower volume and has to drop the price to do it, in this case, inflation adjusted price, we know demand declined. That's not fun to talk about, but it shows up in the numbers again for beef. And the punchline across those three different info sources is domestic meat demand has certainly softened here in 2023.
And Glynn, as we think about all these different things and the market moving around, are there some decision aids that people could be using from Ag Manager?
Yeah, so I've honed in on, and probably sound a little bit like Dr. Bayer here on demand. Everything I've mentioned is there, so please make use of those resources. What you're calling out is a couple of the Excel-based decision tools for more kind of on-the-farm management purposes. Quick shout out, Kevin Duvetter is a former economist, built lots of these. Myself, Robin Reed, Dustin Pendle, some others kind of maintain and update them over time. One of them I made a note of that I recently updated, I believe 10 days ago, was something called the KSU-Beef Replacement tool. The purpose of this is it helps you calculate the net present value of adding another female to your herd. So think buying a heifer if you want to expand your herd, or buying somebody's bred cow, those kind of things. There's a lot of discussion that 2024 might be the year that we pull the trigger on expansion and some rebuild. I personally think there's a decent chance in 24 we're going to have some demand improvement with macroeconomic improvement. So my Dr. Bayer stuff might get toned down by the time we're doing this, say the 4th of July. I also think that if Mother Nature allows it, which is code for it rains and we have forage, there's quite a few cattle producers that are interested in rebuilding their herd. So this particular decision tool is designed to give you an emotionless calculation of what the economic value of adding a female to your herd is. Basically, you plug in your cost to run a cow for the year, 10 years of expected calf revenue. Again, we have defaults for that, but you can change them. And it will give you a number that you can compare to what the current going rate is. And if the number that comes out of our calculator is above what you can get it for, then you should buy that female. If the number comes out of our calculator is below what the market asking price is, then it says you should be hesitant to pull the trigger and make that purchase. So that's the purpose of that particular decision tool.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show discussing some research around specialty livestock and challenges that producers are having. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Assistant Professor in Agricultural Communications and Journalism, Nellie Hill-Sullins, and K-State Assistant Professor in Agricultural Economics, Logan Britton. Logan, Nellie, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Of course, yeah, happy to be here.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
And the research you worked on is titled Kansas Specialty Livestock Producer Challenges. And Logan, before we talk about what that research is and what you found in it, could you first tell us what is specialty livestock in this instance?
Yeah, so specialty livestock, I think it kind of depends on what state you're in, but I think predominantly in Kansas, we kind of think of goat, sheep. You can also include bison, alpaca, llama, pheasant, and so those species that are not the traditional of beef or beef cattle, dairy cattle, hog, but those are the ones we traditionally think about as those traditional protein sources.
And how many of these specialty livestock are in Kansas?
We've got 65,000 head for sheep and lamb, and we've got 37,000 head for meat goats and 4,400 milk goats in the state of Kansas. And just know that those numbers are kind of dated just because of census data. We'll get the most recent census of agriculture this next spring, and so hopefully these numbers will be reported and kind of be more representative of the market that we see in Kansas as well as the nation.
And what producer challenges were you guys looking at in this research?
We were mainly looking at marketing issues. So we experienced from talking with stakeholders in the state of, hey, we are not having a good marketing channel. And so Nellie and I were both kind of curious with our appointments at K-State, we're mainly teaching and research specific. And so this is kind of our opportunity to kind of get into the extension realm of our land grant mission. And so we wanted to help producers in our state. We're both Kansans, so we thought this was an awesome opportunity to help fellow Kansans. And so mainly just those marketing channels of how to get product from point A to point B. So we've got a lot of sheep and goat producers in the state, but they might have issues of getting it to specific customers. consumers, as well as getting those animals rendered and processed into meat products that eventually sell to those end consumers, whether those are restaurants or whether those are 4-H or FFA exhibitors or other businesses in those marketing channels.
You guys broke down this work into sheep, goat, poultry, and then other species. And so as we're looking at those marketing channels, how are you seeing those producers trying to connect with consumers?
So we asked producers some of the ways that they currently market their animals. And in our report, we really break it down by those different species and areas that you listed. But overall, what we're seeing is, of course, a lot of direct-to-consumer marketing happening through social media channels or livestock auctions or website as the primary marketing opportunities. We're also seeing some of that 4-H and FFA sale as a big part of the composition of their marketing as well. And we were excited in our research to figure out some areas where we could help producers in better utilizing those channels, better equipping our extension agents and folks with what our producers need in the specialty livestock area. As Logan talked about, these are non-traditional when we think of protein sources type of species. And so, therefore, we don't know as much about them. And we wanted to illuminate that for these producers. So in some of our findings, really drawing out that our producers want more information about regulations. They want more information and access to processing to strengthen those marketing channels. And so that's really going to help the folks that interact with these producers and create communications and assistance for these producers, while also leading to more research opportunities in these areas as well by getting a lay of the land through this initial survey.
What are some of the different ways that producers do get their information? And is one of those just talking with each other within their industry?
Yeah, that's the most preferred. So, I mean, think about your traditional small town Kansas. I know back around my hometown of Bartlett, people would go into the co-op and have the coffee talk in the morning. So farmers and ranchers doing that. So talking to other producers that way, as well as getting their information from K-State Research and Extension publications, as well as kind of utilizing their network with producer councils and associations. So they're kind of connecting to those professional associations within their individual species to get some information about management and raising of these livestock species. And so, as well as just typically Googling things. And so we see that general internet searches. And so hopefully those internet searches, and we're having some search and optimization and getting directed to KSRE publications, as well as other research and extension publications from other universities.
So maybe a little bit of an opportunity to expand on more information from KSRE?
Of course, yeah. I think there's some opportunity that we can provide more information to goat and sheep and other producers in the specialty livestock realm. And so I think there, again, this helps assess that there's a need for information and getting more of that knowledge out to producers and truly completing our extension mission at K-State.
And what information are producers wanting to see more of?
Yeah, so I think that they really value their animal health, and so they want to know what are some resources that we can provide a nutritious diet, get that good feed-to-gain ratio, and things like that, as well as after these animals are close to harvesting and selling. So how can we get those animals to a processor so they can be rendered for meat processing or similar processes? And so seeing a lot of that, as well as we're kind of seeing this story about veterinary health care. And so having access to vets that specialize in sheep and goat and other species. And so we think of our traditional large animal vets in Kansas, and luckily we have a great vet school here at K-State, but also thinking about we need those small animal vets, even though we typically think of cat and dog for the small animal, but I mean, those medium-sized livestock species also are in need of veterinary care.
As we wrap up the conversation about talking about your Kansas Specialty Livestock Producer Challenges research, how would you conclude what you found in it for producers?
I think anecdotally, we knew some of these things were going on, but this helped quantify some of the issues of things that we were seeing within the state of Kansas. And so that helps us of actually putting numbers down and actually being able to assess of, hey, where do resources need to go in terms of knowledge that is lacking in the current realm, as well as how can we assist them into completing their mission of whether that's getting that product to a restaurant or a small retail store or other marketing channels that they may experience. And so ultimately it's, again, to help them in getting those products to their end destination.
And what's next for this research?
Yeah, so we're really excited. So we kind of say this is the supply side of our research with sheep and goat and other species. And so next we're going to look at the demand side of things. As an economist, I was looking at supply and demand. And so we're going to try to assess willingness to pay and attitudes for sheep and goat meat within the Midwest region. And so we're going to sample representative sample of Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Colorado, Texas, and Oklahoma, and make them go through these really cool choice experiments. And actually, I can calculate willingness to pay for certain attributes, whether they're from that state of resident that the respondent is taking the survey, or if it's out of state, or if it's grain-fed, grass-fed, and those sorts of things. And I actually can isolate certain willingness to pay premiums for certain attributes within a shopping experience for those survey takers.
Are there resources available for producers who might be raising these specialty livestock here in Kansas?
Yes, I would say that there's some, I know for sure that there's some resources with the Animal Sciences Department at K-State.
We've been working in collaboration with the Kansas Department of Agriculture throughout this project, and they're a key partner in helping us really ground our research in the specialty livestock industry and connect us with producers and associations that this work would affect, and helping us to increase the spread of our information. And so in our work with KDA, we've also prepared some materials because it's been important to the whole research team that we're doing applied work that benefits producers and increases the economic viability of this industry in our state. And so one of the first pieces is this report that's available on Ag Manager that tells the producers and those that work with them more about this industry and what their needs are. So maybe they can pinpoint areas of opportunity to increase engagement and servicing of these producers. We also worked with KDA to prepare a report that lists processors and their availability throughout the state, and just making it more readily available through the KDA website, access to the information that our producers indicated they have a lower amount of satisfaction with right now, and then working towards filling some of these information gaps that producers have reported. So we're trying to work for producers and doing more all the time. And as Logan talked about, we're excited to find out more about the consumer so that the producer can better connect with them and reach them through those marketing channels.
Nellie, Logan, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us some information from your Kansas Specialty Livestock Producer Challenges research.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Shelby. Thanks for the opportunity.
That was Kansas State University Assistant Professor in Agricultural Communications and Journalism, Nellie Hill-Sullins, and she was joined by K-State Assistant Professor in Agricultural Economics, Logan Britton, and they were discussing the research they've done on Kansas Specialty Livestock Producer Challenges. You can find their work on agmanager.info, which I will link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. Also in today's show notes will be a link to the resource they were talking about from the Kansas Department of Agriculture. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing raccoons. And to talk about this, we're joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Raccoons, something that can create quite a bit of damage for people.
Yeah, raccoons are kind of an interesting species. They're really strong, they're really smart, and they like a lot of resources that we have that we don't want them to damage. And so there's a lot of people that can have problems with raccoons.
And one of those things they can damage is the yard.
That's right. Recently, we talked about critters that dig in yards and things like that. So raccoons, of course, dig after grubs and earthworms and those sorts of things. They'll also get into pet food that we have. It may be pet food that we're storing outside. They'll get into horse feed, cattle feed, those sorts of things. They'll also get into food that we have out for pets that we're directly putting it out there for them to eat. And so that's another challenge. And those kinds of problems are pretty easy to avoid. So if we don't feed pets free choice outside, then we can avoid a lot of those issues with raccoons interacting with their pets. A good way to deal with that, if you have a pet that you're used to feeding outside, you can put the food out, let them consume what they want, and then just bring it back in. And over time, and pretty quickly actually, they'll get used to that.
And are there times where management is the option because the raccoons just like that place?
There are. So this is a really good time to be thinking about managing raccoons if you have problems with them. It's fur bearer season, and so we have a lot of folks who are interested in harvesting raccoons for their fur through trapping or through hunting with dogs. Raccoons are a very easy species to trap, and we can trap them with cage traps, which are really the most appropriate way to trap them in town. If we're not in town, then my favorite way to catch them is with what's called a dog-proof raccoon trap, which is basically a pipe that encloses the bait, and they reach down into the pipe for the bait and they get captured. And that type of trap is safe if we're thinking about, not catching other kinds of critters. We can put a type of bait that would be cereal with marshmallows in it, like maybe the generic Lucky Charms type cereal, down in those, and then that's going to avoid any cats or anything like that getting in the trap too. And so they're quite easy to catch, and pretty much anywhere throughout the state, there's probably a youngster who would really like the opportunity to try and trap raccoons. So if folks are having problems, this is a really good time to find somebody who might be willing to help you with that.
For someone who has trapped a raccoon, what do they do with it afterwards?
Yeah, so we do have a market for the fur of raccoons. It's not very high right now. So that's one of the things a lot of people are trying to figure out is what do they do with their raccoon hides? Well, this is a really good time to learn how to process those furs yourself, because if you do mess them up, it's not a big deal. You're not wasting a lot of money. So fleshing them, drying them, and then tanning them yourself, and then that end product you can actually sell for a lot of money on like Etsy or someplace like that to somebody who wants it for a wall hanging or who wants to make something out of that fur.
While we're talking about managing raccoons, there is an important reminder that not everything is legal to do.
That's right. One of the things that I hear folks talk about a lot is poisoning raccoons with fly bait. And specifically the product that most folks are talking about when they talk about that is a product that's the active ingredient is methomyl. It's called golden malrin. And some people recommend mixing it with pop and then putting it out in a pan for the raccoons. And I really want to reinforce that that's an illegal use of a registered pesticide product. People do get prosecuted for that after pets get poisoned. It's a very indiscriminate way to put out a pesticide, and we don't have any registered products in Kansas that a person could legally use for coyotes or raccoons or those sorts of species that might be causing damage. And with how easy raccoons are to trap, there's really no excuse for doing something illegal like that.
Just a key point from that I want to point out, it doesn't just kill raccoons, it creates issues for a lot of different species.
Yeah, really any mammal that consumed it would either get really sick or die. And if they consume a lethal dose, they die really quickly. And so there's not really an opportunity to give a pet an antidote or something like that.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back tomorrow with more.